portrait for that family. And so we have some of those as examples. So we were thinking, well, maybe this is a death portrait of a Covill child. All right, and there it is. That's our little boy. And you can see how the canvas is really kind of roughed up. And it's over in Skinny Atlas, Mattville right now, being restored because we got the grant. So it should be coming to us in the spring, and you'll be able to come to see it at an unveiling at the Fabius Historical Society. We know it was done from a tintype, because that was in Perry's diaries. Perry kept extensive diaries. And a lot of time he would enter about what he was painting. So he did talk about this in his diary. And the portrait was dated 1873. So eventually we go to the Perry diaries.
Yeah, the information.
No,
Says it's on.
here we can trade.
Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So we have Covill in parens because this is what was on the back of the portrait itself in Perry's hand. He also dated it 1873. He did sign it. And he wrote the note on the back of the portrait, painted from a tintype. Now this would not have been unusual. He did not just do death portraits from the corpse itself, although he did do that. And we do have an example of an infant, a sketch of an infant that had died, and then the actual portrait that he did for, we presume it's for the family. So this was, as Ruth has said, very standard practice, but this one was a little different in the sense that we know it was painted from a tintype because that is in Perry's own hand. So just in case anybody needs to come up to speed a little bit on what tintype is, we gave you just a couple slides on that. So if this explanation makes sense to folks, or you have experience with tintypes, it's basically a photograph, but it was made on a thin plate of tin, and here are some synonyms for it, and it was very popular in the late 1800s, but it was actually used as a method of photography as late as the 1940s. And we have an example here of a person who was making tintypes, and you can see how cumbersome that machine is. Just to get, so that was the then day camera, if you will, and then this is an example of a ferrotype or a tintype, and you can see that it's very characteristic in its overall dark shading, which I think people associate with tintype photographs. So, we wanted to know more about this kid. We knew it was Covill family, C-O-V-I-L-L.
That's what we thought.
But we made some assumptions. And you see some of the assumptions we made there. We assumed it was a death portrait. We assumed the child was male. We assumed, because this was 1870s, that the family must have been located in the Cazenovia area or the Delphi Falls area because that was where Perry was working and living at the time. And we made the assumption about Scottish or Irish heritage because if you look at the clothes the child has on, there's very definitely a Scottish, probably Scottish plaid outfit as opposed to Irish. But yeah, we left the door open. We were making assumptions, you know, go for it.
And then we start looking. She finds Covills, I find Covills, and they keep finding them and finding them. And I found one little sad Covill child that lived near McConnellsville. And he actually died by hanging out in the barn. And he was about 11 years old. So for a while I thought, gee, is he our kid? But he's kind of far away. And so we keep looking. We look at censuses, you name it, we looked at it. And
And this information that you see here is information that we got from the Perry diaries themselves. We just started combing the Perry diaries from about 1871. Well, we started with 1873, and then we kept going backwards, looking for Covill references. And it's important for you to note that Perry was very consistent in his spelling of Covill. It was always C-O-V-I-L-L. So we assumed that was the family's surname. He did refer to the child at times as a boy, so we knew we were correct there in that he was male. But the rest of the diaries didn't give us any clue about how the portrait was commissioned. All of a sudden, he just started talking about the Covill portrait. So we have no idea who approached him or why, but he did have a lot of descriptive references about how he was painting the face, the clothing, and the background. There was another reference in late 1873 in his journal that he had agreed with the family that the painting was worth $50. Now this is $1873. And there's a reference in his diary about trading. He bartered. He didn't get money. He got a new suit of clothing for the portrait.
And that becomes our good read.
Exactly. And he talked very frequently about meeting Covill or the Covill husband and wife in Cazenovia for their transactions. Keep looking out. Okay.
So,
But absolutely no mention of when, why, or by whom the portrait was commissioned.
and so Anne just loves Find a Grave. So Anne always likes to go to Find a Grave. So she goes to Find a Grave, and she finds this information about the Covills. And it looks like, we're in Madison and Onondaga County, we're on the money. It's got to be one of those Covill families. And there's more than one living in these two counties.
Yep, but notice again the spellings. We're smart enough to know in our genealogy searching we have to be careful about surnames. I'm sure you all have the same experience, maybe even in your own families. How your ancestors might have spelled their surnames could be very, very different from what's happening in this day and age. So, as you can see, we tried his spelling. We got no viable matches. We searched Covill with an E on the end, no viable matches. Then we found a C-O-V-I-L.
And it's even different spellings in the census when you look at them. And so I think Anne came up with this family.
I did, yeah, I did. So we found a family in New Woodstock Cemetery, C-O-V-I-L. And then we found these folks in the same plot in the New Woodstock Cemetery. So instantly we thought, hey, okay, maybe Watson is the son who was actually in the Covill child portrait.
But then we keep looking and we find more Covills.
Well, we just before we left, the reason we gave up on Frank is we left Find a Grave and went to the census records of 1860 and 1900. We found that Frank C. was a farmer. So we couldn't really reconcile the notion
He's
that
going to
he
make
would,
a suit.
yeah, that he was going to make a suit, and that there would be a barter between a suit of clothing and a portrait. That didn't make sense. So we thought we better keep looking.
And let's see. Okay, so you're going to do that next. And I really found a lot of good stuff in the census, and I'll talk about that later.
Right.
Anne's going to talk about the Cazenovia Republican newspaper.
So we didn't really know how to track down a merchant from the 1800s, except by perhaps looking through some old newspapers, seeing if we could find references to any Covills or find ads, for example. And that would help us with, of course, the spelling of the surname, and it might help us with some references to a clothing merchant. So we went back. Did you know that the Cass Republican, like many, many newspapers, all the way back, are online? So, and they're searchable, which is awesome. So it'll take you to, you know, the volume you're looking for, and you can actually search that. It's searchable. You can put in search terms, and it'll pop up the places in those newspapers where that name or that search phrase shows up. So we went to Cass Republican. So notice the dates: 1872, 1884, 1879. So now we're in the right time period. And we found a C.W. Covill. Now the spelling of the names you see up there are actually what showed up in the newspaper. Okay? So now we've got the Covill. Well, that matches Perry. That matches what he was doing. And now we have initials. Hey, hallelujah. So we know it's not Frank. Okay, and now look at this one. This was an exciting one, the middle one. C.W. Covill of Covill and Rick and George Rouse of Hobby and Rouse have returned from New York, and Casanovias can calculate upon seeing a fine display of new spring styles. Bingo. We've got somebody who's in the clothing business. So we got really excited with this hit, as it were, because now we've got some initials, CW, and we've got a connection to a tailor or a merchant. Okay?
And she was busy looking at the Casanova Republican. I was busy then going to census records, and my really cool was, oh, you got the ad coming up though, haven't you?
Yeah.
So,
We've got, well, we went back to find a grave, and what we found, CW, there we go. Charles Wright, but notice how the last name is spelled.
with an E.
With an E. It's not so Covill, it was Covell. But Charles is buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Cazenovia, so now we went back with the surname of Covill, Covell, and we did another search through the Cass Republican. Now remember, this was a search through the Cass Republican too, but we were searching on the surname Covill. And we found these hits. Okay, we went back to Cass Republican, searching for a Charles Wright or Covell, and bingo. We found an ad. So clearly the man spelled his name, Covell, and the Cass Republican was misspelling his name in their write-ups about him.
But maybe he didn't know how to spell his name either. Because I found out later, in the 1800s, well, his wife passes away and then he gets remarried. But he really couldn't write well, and he had to take his son with him to get his passport.
So, as Ruth noted, she was going through the census records. So here's the 1905 New York State Census. And there he is, Charles W., occupation merchant. Bingo. We got him.
And then you see a son listed there. But the trouble is, you have a hard time reading that name. Is that Eddie? Or what is that name? So you keep looking back at census.
Right.
And I found Covill actually in the 1860 census, and he was living in Madison, and he was selling clothing. He was a merchant. It was listed as a tailor. And then we know he's in Cazenovia later in life, and he is selling clothing.
Yep.
So this has got to be the right man.
Right. So then we go back to the Evergreen Cemetery and look for Covell and look for more Covills. And in the C.W. Covill plot, we find Mary, Eddie, Isabel, and, whoa, Willie.
Yeah, and Nancy and I did go there, and so we know these statistics that are given here are what are on the tombstones there. And the man was very nice, took us right to the grave site and talked to us about it. And then this Willie deal gets very confusing, because in the census, I found that there was a Willie early. Willie passes away, you can see, as a young boy. He's almost 4. So was that Willie in the portrait? Or later, in the Madison census for Nelson, he's got 2 boys living with him. He's got a William, and he's got an Eddie, not spelled like you would spell Eddie. It's kind of A instead of E. So census takers always couldn't spell either, so that's another problem. So that's why you get so many spellings in life. But as we keep looking at the census.
Yeah, so at this point, we're pretty sure we got the right family, because we've got a Taylor in Cazenovia. So that fits the evidence we have up from the Perry diary about bartering for clothes for portrait and about the Kaz connection. But as Ruth has already suggested, now just based on this cemetery search, we know that it could be Eddie or Willie. And notice the death, and Willie died by 1859, so it could have been a tintype of Willie as a young boy before he died, and then the 1873 portrait could have been done. Or it could have been Eddie at any age, because he was certainly born 1865, so that would have been well before 1873. And again, if we know it was done based on a tintype, then it's not really helping us with the age of the child in the portrait.
And actually, this is where Nancy and I had fun, because she picks Eddie to be the child, and I pick William, another boy that crops up on the scene in the census, living with the Covills. And he kind of disappears, and I think he eventually goes west, so that's why we lose him. And then I lost him. I had him for a while, and then I didn't keep right with him that day, and I dropped it. And then Ancestry never took me back to that site I was at. So I never could find that William again. So Nancy and I would have fun, because we'd argue over which kid it was, and we'll never know.
Yeah, we have no way now to figure out which child it actually was, because our conundrum, of course, is, well, at this point, the only thing we can think of is we would have to have some kind of record or some kind of descendant memory that would help us make some kind of connection of either Eddie or Willie as the child in the portrait. But as Ruth said earlier, she was checking out the 1860 federal census, and we saw very consistently that C.W. Covill and his family were in the Nelson, Cazenovia area for a very long period of time. But, as she had just mentioned, all of a sudden in the New York State Census in 1865, whoa, wait a minute, now we got William, and this was 65, Willie died in 59, so this can't be Willie. So now who is this?
And then, at one time, I didn't talk to you about this, Ann. At one time, I almost thought they had taken those 2 boys in from another Covill family, Eddie and William. And maybe they really weren't their kids to begin with. They were a brother's kids, because he had so many kids, he gave them to. Who knows?
We do know that we're still talking about Charles W. in 1865, but as Ruth has pointed out, we just don't know where William came from all of a sudden, because he wasn't there before in the previous census, and now he's here. So go 5 years further, and now all of a sudden the census is showing no William whatsoever. We can't find William. He was 8 in 65, but notice he's not even listed in the household in 1870. And now, look at these, the two bottom. So who's Willis Kenyon, or Kenyon Willis, and Clark, or Eddie Clark? Oh, so, okay, who's that?
Well, Eddie's the boy that continues to live with him all the rest of his days and are buried with him. And Eddie actually, I think, was some kind of photographer, wasn't he, later in life? Nancy found out. And she did find out where he was living in Casanova. She tried to contact those people to see if they had any information about Eddie or any pictures of Eddie. And she was to hear from them when they came back from wherever they live in the wintertime. I don't know if we'll ever hear from them or not.
Well, we're still a little confused as to whether Eddie Clark, we're assuming because of the punctuation there that Eddie Clark, but he's not the same child as the Eddie in the earlier one, right? Because the ages are different.
No, I think the age is pretty consistent on Eddie.
So that matches what's in the cemetery record? Oh, okay, I'm sorry. But we don't know who Willis is.
Well, he could be William. Who knows who that kid is?
But it's also possible that his last name is Kenyon, so that he's not a Covill, correct?
Well, you'd look at that, and I think they're middle names, though.
Okay. Once again, it's kind of hard to decipher because you don't really have any kind of legend or you know, this is how you read this census documentation.
So you can see what kind of fun you have doing your genealogy work. Sometimes you just run into stone walls and you can't get past them.
Oh. So we went back and just double-checked the Evergreen Cemetery records and looked for more Covills. We actually did a broad search of Evergreen Cemetery in general and said, tell us every Covill who's in Evergreen Cemetery in Casanova. And we got more folks. So now we've got Eddie and...
This is the same Covill that you had up before.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Okay. So then we went to the 1892 census. Now we're getting out pretty far from the 1873 time period. But there, as Ruth has said, now the Covills are in Nelson, and we think the Addie C is a typo or miswritten, and that must be Eddie Clark. And again, because census takers sort of buried in their accuracy, should we say, we think that's still, but notice that Willis isn't there. Willis Kenyon isn't there anymore. So we've lost two. We lost the Willie and we lost the Kenyon, Willis Kenyon. And so we were kind of left with, we know the family, but we don't know which child.
And may never know which child.
Because we had no way of going a step further to link that child, either child, to that portrait. That was the big problem.
Oh, that's a good one, too, when you get to the 1900 census and you see right there, I'm listed as a merchant tailor, so he's following in his father's footsteps for a few years. And daughter-in-law, Isabel, is definitely his wife. And they continue to stay very close to his father. So I think Nancy would like it to be Eddie. I have to be here and push for her.
Yeah, they've had some interesting conversations about this, and neither of them has sufficient data to sway me one way or the other, so. So they're one for one.
So we'd have good time with it.
We did. So we felt like we got a little bit closer to the fact that we know the family and can confirm those connections that Perry was writing about in his journals. But again, without he seems consistently in the journal entries we've seen so far about his paintings that he did not keep records of who commissioned him for what purpose. And so we have sort of a reason why that portrait was being done. We have many, many of his portraits, and they're wonderful. But we're coming up really short from his own records about the who and the why and the what.
He's just a little cold, little boy.
So we backtracked immediately and said, I guess we better stop talking about it as a death portrait, because since it was from a tintype and one of our two contenders, I will say, lived quite a long time, so we have to be careful thinking that it's a death portrait. So Ruth went out one more census to 1905.
Yeah. And they're still there.
Yeah, we find that Eddie actually got younger. Because here, the age listed was 33 in 1900, and in 1905, he went down to 28.
And I forgot, though, because his first wife does die, and he does get a second wife just before he dies.
Charles does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we were thrilled that we had a lot of confluence in the information we could find among all these different sources. It's very fun to go through the census records and then all the online records that are available. But this was the first time we actually went out into things like newspapers to see if we could actually make the linkages about people's careers and professions. And that all helped us line up too. The downside of all of this, of course, was we had to be really, really careful about surnames. Because even in the same source, like the Cas Republican, the surname was not spelled the same way. And for any of you who've done genealogy searches, I'm sure you've had similar experiences.
And you probably would find in your own research with your own family, you're going to find your family spells your name different ways through the centuries. Like Hotaling has many, many spellings. And can I flip to the next page there? These people helped Nancy a lot. I talked to Sarah several different times myself. Sarah was a historian for Madison County for a while, and for New Woodstock, and for Casanova. And Sarah was as confused as we were. She just didn't know. She came up with those three boys also. And the William and Willis deal really blew her mind away. She said, I was beginning to wonder if they were twins.
So there's a lot we don't know about the children we saw and then lost track of them. Because again, when that's coming from census records, the very first thing we've learned to do is to be sensitive to the fact that there could be inaccuracies in those census records.
Right, and a lot of times people didn't recite the ages right of the members of the household. So you will find that big discrepancy from one census to the next, that somebody could be 5 years off in age or whatever, Because whoever is there in the household is the one that gives the ages. And if they're new to the household, they may just come as close to the age as they think they can.
Questions, thoughts? Yeah.
Did you consider trying to link them up with Wells and Cloverly in Syracuse, the Culvers?
No, didn't occur to me.
Well, from that length of time, they could have mixed with some of the ones they were clothing merchants.
Sure.
That's what they do, don't they?
Do they?
Wells and Cloverly sell clothes.
Yeah, okay, great.
Well, that's another avenue.
Yeah, exactly right, exactly
Then they
right.
said that Charles always went to New York City to buy his merchandise.
Right.
And a question I have, this Linda Young that gave you the fit child's portrait, is she still alive?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
the person
Is she
in Florida,
related? Is she-
but she's the younger generation.
Uh-huh, and were that family related, or how did she come about?
They lived in the house in Casanova that the Covills lived in.
And this was
And
one
the
there?
portrait came out of that house.
And that was the only thing that you knew of that came out, Ruthie, or they didn't say anything?
You don't know anything more?
No, she didn't know anything more.
No, that's right.
Okay,
Right, because I think Nancy talked to her, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Did you find Mary's maiden name? I think of Clark, it should be a middle name because that was her maiden name.
Correct. That's a
But
really
that's a
good.
very common name and it's spelled several ways, so there you go.
Mhm.
We didn't track that down, but that's a really good observation, yeah.
Well, I found in different places, the wife's maiden name was different.
You mean between
From
the
different
sources?
records you were looking in, they would report her as this person, or if she's over here as this person, but she had the first name would be the same.
I don't know that we had, did we have, oh, there we go,
Goodrich.
Goodrich.
Yeah. But one time I found her listed as something else besides that, so.
I was going to say, that triggered that thought, because I thought, I think we did see a maiden name for her, so. Yes,
Did you consider that Willis might be a female and maybe she came in for a while as a mother's helper or something?
certainly.
No, at least on the census, it was listed as a male.
Oh, and listed as, yeah, farm laborer, right, and it was listed as a male,
So
yeah.
hopefully they don't blow that part.
We're never sure.
I think we're fairly solid thinking that Willis Kenyon is an employee, not a family member.
I think so. I would have made that assumption too. Do you make that assumption, Ruth?
I don't know.
We
But
don't know for
because a
sure.
lot of times the sons are listed as farm laborers. And they are the son. And just because you see that farm laborer doesn't mean that it's a hired worker. It's their kid working on the farm.
But
Yep.
it's Kenyon, Willis, which makes me think it's not a family member.
Well, Eddie's listed as Eddie Clark.
But there's no comma,
There's no
which doesn't mean anything necessarily.
Well, we have to go back that one census before where both boys are on.
Yeah, and Eddie Clark, the Clark Eddie, we did see in later census records, an Eddie C. and, yeah. So we're assuming that's the same person because the ages line up, except of course at the end when he gets younger. Other thoughts? Anybody know the Covills? Anybody know which kid this was? No? So we're asking around. Yes.
Right. I'm Lorena Bumpus Thurble. We are related to a Covill, but they spelled our Covill C-O-V-I-L, which has been changed, I know, many times. We have a Julie, a Stephen, and I have the book here on our genealogy from our family. And I do have some information, but it's all different from what you have here.
Okay.
But I will be investigating.
Okay, and that fits because of all the different spellings we were finding. Even once we nailed down the right family, we were still getting different spellings for that one
Yeah.
particular
So
person.
he's ID, he's AD, he's different.
Yeah. But we're thrilled that we actually, A, got the portrait, and B, that we were able to get this much information about it. And so we've changed our slant on this with the school children who come to the museum. Instead of talking about death portraits, with this particular portrait, we'll be talking about
The
tin
clothing
types.
style,
Yeah, clothing style, tin types, and that kind of thing. So it's
hairstyle.
still a nice big win for us. So if any of you are interested or you are part of organizations that need that kind of assistance, it's the Greater Hudson Network that has a grant program, and they fund art restoration. It's conservation. I have to be careful of my language. It's conservation, it's not restoration. And they ask about the grant application. You don't have to have the sort of definitive provenance of the article, but they do want to know its significance to educational purposes and to New York. So we were able to make, of course, a very strong case for how important John Calvin Perry is to the central New York area, because we're aware of at least 200 paintings that the man did in this area, and they're very localized, many, many wonderful landscapes, and of course, his work relative to family portraits. So we were able to build, I think, obviously a convincing argument that this restoration would serve good educational and New York State significance criteria. And the restoration is will need between $5,000 and $6,000. And there was extensive water damage to the portrait. Let me go back and put that up again. And it is punctured in several places. But as Ruth said, Westlake has it, and part of that grant process, you have to have an approved conservator do an analysis up front, which cost us about $300. That's not refundable by the grant, but it does get the application completed the way Greater Hudson wants to see it. And then they just make an assessment of how significant work this is relative to the state. And we got it. We were thrilled. So,
And it's going to have a nice new frame.
yeah, they're going to put a nice new frame on it for it. It came unframed. It came in the shape that you see it there. So I would encourage you, Greater Hudson Heritage Network, if you're interested in those kinds of conservation grants. It's an annual thing, so it would be coming back around. Other thoughts, questions, suggestions?
I'm trying to decide how old that child is in the picture.
Well, it's very hard to tell because I got thinking this morning, he painted this from a tintype. It's not like the typical ones where he saw the child or he saw the adult and he really made his own sketch. He's taking a tintype. Lord knows what kind of condition the tintype is, if it's the little deceased boy from the 1850s, maybe the portrait's not clear. So he paints the child the best that he can see that he looks, so maybe he's got him looking a little too old.
What age would you guess? Did you have a thought?
How old were boys when they stopped wearing dresses in that time period?
Well, he's actually got his little top on and his pants.
Little boys wore dresses in the 19th century, but I don't know how long that went on.
Well, at that time, I would think you would only wear them for the first year.
Oh,
Colonial times, you would have worn them if you were a pilgrim boy up until you were about 6 years old.
no, I was gonna say, up to about 6, I've seen portraits and even, some in the family where they're dressed for, for something formal like a sitting or a picture.
People have guessed as young as maybe 4 and as old as maybe 10.
So that would make it the first child, the Willie that's buried with them in the cemetery in Casanova.
But it also could be Eddie also.
Yeah, Nancy always thought that it was Eddie because she wanted it to be
They
Eddie.
lost a child, and that's the only son who might go on with the family, if they might have preserved it. I would go with Eddie.
Well, thanks for thinking through it with us, and thanks for your time. This is fun.
Thank you.
Looks like they have fun this.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I really appreciate all of you people who have such a strong interest in history, preserving it, keeping it, interpreting it, treasuring it, and then people like this that are willing to work that hard. I really appreciate that, and I really thank you for what you did.
And if you'd like to look at our collection,
Okay.
these are the ones that we have, and you're welcome to look at this notebook. And Nancy loved to be very extensive on John Calvin Perry, because after all, he was born in Delphi Falls, lived in Delphi Falls, and is buried in Delphi Falls. And Nancy lived for a long time in Delphi Falls. John Calvin Perry actually became a teacher, an art teacher. He taught art in Manlius, he taught art in New Woodstock, he taught art classes in DeRuyter, and he taught art classes in Casanova. So, gee, don't you think you'd meet that merchant a lot in Casanova if he was teaching art classes at the seminary in Casanova? So, I think that Covill's the right Covill. Yes.
This Perry could be descended from the naval guy named Perry, because he did come to DeRuyter at one time.
Isn't that Peary rather than Perry?
Perry?
I thought Admiral Peary?
Yeah.
P-E-A-R-Y. But then you
Spelling,
got the
what
spelling.
difference does that make?
But he is extended out because I got emails, and she finally came up and even saw us. She went to Cooperstown to go to the library at the Fenimore Library, and his father, Caleb, came from Simon Perry down on the Hudson. I forget the name of the community right now. But she came up to the library in Cooperstown at the Fenimore House and went through the diaries, found the page that was the house down on the Hudson that Perry drawed of his grandfather's house, and talked about visiting there. And so we have that copied and available for people to see. And then she did the line of Simon's children and their children to match what we have of the Perry line up here. So we can trace them now back to that Simon Perry on the Hudson. And I think if you trace back far enough, he probably would go to a Revolutionary War soldier in one of the New England states.
Well, as you can see, it's hard work to be a historian. I know you do hard work too, but the work involved in doing this, and we're so glad that there are people who want to do this, know how, do it well, people like you. That's so important. When Irene and I first moved here in 1971, we realized very quickly that a lot of people love to live here. They've been here maybe all their lives, and if anything can be done to leave behind history in some retrievable form, that is a very good thing. And so let me mention the next meeting in February 2nd. Ed and Margie West will present a program titled History Embedded in Quilts. How many of you are quilt makers?
My sister is, but she doesn't live here.
Invite her. Oh, well. Yeah, that's a way of putting some of the history into fabric form. Of course, my wife Irene is a quilter, belongs to a quilting group, and one of her quilts took 3 years to make, and we didn't know what to do with it. It's so valuable. And so we decided to give it to the first family member who gets a Nobel Prize. It hasn't happened yet, and in the meantime, we're just using it ourselves and enjoying it very much. At any rate, let me just mention something very quickly. This past year, a little more than a year, I think you all know this, but we lost 2 members of our community who have done so much for us and preserving history and teaching and many other things, and that's Don Edwards and Nancy Edwards. And it's just our relationship with them over the years has been so rewarding. Let me just tell you one thing. When we moved into our house, there were a whole lot of things that needed to be done. And so we picked up linoleum, we painted, we built walls and so forth. And taking up the linoleum in the closet, we found some newspapers. History, let's read these. What's in it? And what we found was an announcement of the marriage of Don and Nancy Edwards. Now, this was very important and a big deal for us because we had recently attended, as I recall, the 25th anniversary of their marriage. And I thought, I wonder if they have a copy of these. Let's call them. And so we called them, and we got in the car. They said, sure, come on over. He said, we do have a few other people here, but come on over. So we got in the car, we're driving along. Irene was reading through the papers again, and something popped up that worried us. And that was the date in the paper of the wedding, and the date we celebrated at their house in a big celebration were not the same dates. And so we began to wonder, maybe we shouldn't do this. But we called them. They're expecting us. And so we went over, and there was quite a large group of people there. And they're all reading the paper and talking about it and enjoying. Don pulled me aside and he said, I better explain something to you. Those dates are not the same. He said, one of the members of the family, I think it was Nancy's mother, said, well, yeah, you did get married and you had a nice little ceremony, but it should have been bigger. And we got more people to invite, so they got married again. And I have just as I look at them and think about them, what a wonderful couple they were over the years. And certainly, in every aspect of history, Nancy has given so much. And Don, sometimes in a different way, has given so much. He made up this little village that exists in his imagination. He gave people names, and every noontime he would tell a story about them and what they were doing. And it didn't matter what I was doing. I might have been cleaning rag cages, but I'd stop, I'd turn the radio on, and listen to his stories. And in those stories, yeah, lots of interesting work, but also he's telling us something about how people lived and so forth. So we're certainly going to miss them. I just wanted to give them a little bit of a tribute as best I could. And folks, great stuff over here. Enjoy it, talk to your friends, take your time. We're so glad you came. We're so glad to have you 2 people here tonight.